The proceeding will start shortly.
We'll start the formal procedures in just a second, then we'll come over to you shortly after we begin and ask you to introduce yourself and who you are, who you represent. Okay? Thank you very much for coming today. 5, 4, 3. Welcome everyone to this afternoon's session of the Levelling Up Housing and Community Select Committee. This afternoon we've got a second session on the inquiry we're doing into children, young people and the built environment, looking at how the planning system, development, provision of facilities are geared up or not geared up to the needs and interests of children and young people. Before I come over to our first panel of witnesses, because we have two panels this afternoon, I'll ask committee members to put on record any interests they may have that may be directly relevant. I'm a Vice President of the Local Government Association.
I'm a member of Bedford Town Deed Board and employee councillor in my constituency office.
Tom?
I'm a member of Ipswich Town Deal Board and I employ 2 councillors in my office.
Right, thank you for that. Welcome to both of you. Would you like to introduce yourselves and say who you are and who you represent today?
Shall I start? Yeah. So my name is Tim Gill. I am an independent researcher and writer and consultant, and all of my work focuses on children's outdoor play and mobility. I used to work for what is now Play England, but I went independent about nearly 20 years ago now, in fact, and amongst other things, I'm the author of this book, which is called Urban Playground, How Child-Friendly Planning and Design Can Save Cities, which draws on the experiences of a number of cities in making their built environment more child-friendly.
I'm Dinah Bornat. I'm an architect. I run a practice called ZCD Architects in London. We have 6 employees. We are architects and designers. We do lots of different types of housing, regeneration, and our expertise is around child-friendly planning. So that's for design and engagement with children and young people. Right,
thank you both for coming this afternoon. Just to both of you, just looking at overall the research you've been doing, and particular issues you've identified, what are those key issues that from your research over many years, looking at these particular challenges around children and young people and what they've been provided with or not provided with, what are the key issues you'd like to draw out for us at the beginning of our discussions today?
I think I want to flag up the importance of mobility in all of this. So how do children get around their neighbourhoods? I think when you talk to almost anybody about, neighbourhoods, housing, built environment and kids, then you'll often immediately get drawn into conversations about playgrounds. Oh yes, we need more play areas. And I'm not saying play areas are not, and play facilities are not important, but the evidence from the science about how you get more children out and active is pretty clear that the single most important influencing factor on what makes neighbourhoods places where children can go out, spend time outdoors and play, those factors are to do with mobility and transport. They're to do with children being able to walk easily around their neighbourhoods and, crucially, being safe from the threat of traffic. So that's a really clear finding that's now, actually from places all around the world. I think the other finding I want to share is more at the kind of, if you like, how do we get change, and that the cities that are most effective in making neighbourhoods work better for children, and the countries that have done that most effectively, really see children as a kind of prism or a lens for the whole of the planning system. So it's a strategic question that's taken seriously about how a focus on children both makes concrete what good places look like. They're walkable, they're compact, they're green, they're welcoming, but it also helps to build consensus and a kind of long-term vision and a robust vision about what good places look and feel like. Because when we think when we think about children, we can't help but think about the whole of their lives. You heard a lot in the first hearing about all of the bad stuff that happens when planning doesn't work for children, and it casts a shadow over their whole life. So if we can get that right, and we can get the different stakeholders who shape neighbourhoods to think about children strategically from the outset, then you can build a stronger long-term consensus, and one that's less at risk of being kind of pushed hither and thither by short-term economic considerations or just other factors. It helps really consolidate a vision, I think.
So I've been working in this area for about 10 years. We started doing some research about 10 years ago because we were very interested in this idea that Tim talks about, this idea of child-friendly design. And I think the question that we asked was, well, what does that mean in terms of architecture and urbanism and planning and layouts? And the first thing that we did was we actually, with the support of Homes England, we did a piece of work looking at 10 housing estates across England, because Homes England were concerned with how their housing developments were performing. They wanted to know whether the layout of the development was actually working from a social perspective, because if you imagine the investment in new developments isn't just about numbers, it's about getting the layout right so that people are enjoying where they live, they feel that they can lead healthy lives and so on. So what we did for that piece of work was to do what's called observational studies. We basically I got researchers to stand in open spaces in housing estates and actually count how many people were using the spaces. And what we discovered was there was a really big difference in terms of the different kinds of layouts. So the biggest finding from our perspective was that spaces that worked well not only worked for children, and children would be outside using the external spaces for hours, but also for adults. So there's a sort of really strong link between kind of good social use of space and use by children. And when that worked really well, there was one particular thing that was in place, and that was that there was space outside your front door or outside your back door where you could just literally kind of tumble out of your house and go and play and meet friends. And that was the determining factor. It's what we basically call doorstep play. It's what a lot of us might have had when we were younger, when the cars weren't there, and it's what works for children. So we did over 250 hours of observational work. We then built on that and started to talk to residents, and their conversations that we had with residents, particularly with children and young people, really chimed with that. So we've got a mapping system now that you can use. You can use it at a very early stage for sort of like capacity studies that developers carry out, which essentially looks for good layouts, and that direct accessibility is the key kind of tenet, if you like. But on top of that, you need to think about the whole strategic layout of the space, the way it might be, those spaces might be connected to other spaces, whether they're car-free and whether they're overlooked. So we did find, like Tim says, that distinct kind of play areas weren't particularly popular. The play equipment wasn't the kind of determining factor about whether children went out at all. It was really about whether there were spaces for them to play with their friends. And like Tim says, this idea that they could kind of move around, call on friends. And what that did, and I can come to this in a bit, is that kind of built strong communities, because if in fact you could have this conversation with anybody that you know, you can ask them to describe the spaces that they grew up or that they live in now, and you'll find a really strong connection between this idea of kind of doorstep space and then access to countryside or ability to walk to school. It literally starts with that first stepping stone outside the front door. Unfortunately, it's not how a vast majority of the developments are laid out, though.
Well, come on, explore perhaps why not, but just one simple question. Are these issues that you just described, which might seem self-evidently true to people listening, are they not taken account of simply because adults are selfish?
I think that's probably true. I think there's also just a kind of a lack of conversation in this area. I think that one of the easiest ways to get people thinking about childhood, if you like, is to not think about children today or think about your own children or other people's children. It's to think about your own childhood. And actually, it turns out that all of us, if we did play out as children, hold on to that memory so strongly. I do sort of workshops and stuff where I offer them some money for that memory, and they say, "You're not buying it off me." It's so central to who I am as a human being that I wouldn't let go of it. And So I posed the question, why not give that to this next generation? And they sort of, the penny drops. It's that penny drop moment where they go, of course. But I thought it was playgrounds and it's like, no, it's what you had. It's that experience to be able to be free. And that's what children are looking for today. If you ask them, they're not actually that interested in, they're more interested in playing out than they are in their mobile phones. You just need to ask.
Yeah, so I would agree. And so I don't think it's so much selfishness as a kind of having lost touch with some things that once we remind ourselves of our childhoods, we reconnect with those emotions, and I think in particular the importance of feeling that that you are someone who has a stake in the community that you live in, and that you have some kind of claim over the people and places beyond your home and school, and that you can explore, and you can gradually spread further afield. Those emotions, I think with grown-ups they can sometimes they can recede because they're crowded out by our more pressing concerns, which I think is a different thing than selfishness. It's a kind of just a loss of an emotional connection. But I think you can rebuild those connections in adults.
Hey, talk about connections. Let's move on just quickly to government. So what connections have you had with them? And it's interesting when the Permanent Secretary spoke to us recently that there doesn't seem to be much connection within government about these matters. Probably passed the parcel about which department's responsible. Probably many are. But, a pretty stark admission that D-Look and Department for Education, she didn't know had been talking to each other about these matters. Is that a concern? Is that sort of your experience?
I think it's really concerning. I think, like I said, that I was connected to Homes England at the beginning, and I was really encouraged that they wanted to help carry out that study. I should say they didn't commission it. It was paid for by the NHBC, but they did, help make it happen. But then since then, no real sort of interest. And I think I haven't seen what the Permanent Secretary said, but I do think that this kind of connection that's needed across departments. Did you say the Department for Education, but also the Department for Health, Department for Transport, Department for Environment? I mean, all of these are interconnected issues, and actually, I work on actual development projects, and highways and health impact assessments are required at a local level. Those connections need to be made. So the fact that the conversations aren't being had at a national level seems kind of crazy. But I think government really does need to kind of get involved.
Yeah, that's certainly been my experience. And I mean, I know it's hard to, a huge problem right now, as Dinah said. There's no obvious lead department for this topic, or lead unit, or so that having served a few months in the civil service back in the day on secondment, looking at children's play in the early 2000s, I know how important it is to just know, who do I go to, who can I ask, and that's a problem. But I also think that there's some interest within some non-departmental public bodies. Homes England, Sport England are actually becoming quite interested in children's outdoor play as part of their sort of active lifestyle brief and their active partnerships work. I've had some contact with them over that, but it's often dependent upon one or two individual officials, and then so it's not strategic, it's not embedded, and it's very at the whim of that person and their superiors as to whether anything gets seen through. So I think we really need a clarity about who within government, not just at the political level, but at the level of officials and agencies, is tackling this issue.
In terms of political responsibility, the Town and Country Planning Associations previously suggested we should have a Secretary of State for children. Is that necessary? Would that be a solution?
Yeah, we talked about that. I mean, it's a good idea. I think it's kind of scandalous that there isn't one, but my hunch is that the problem with children in a built environment is a level or two down. That it's about having someone within DLUC or within the Office for Place, or who's closer to the action, who's closer to how planning policy gets gets shaped. And that, yes, a Secretary of State for Children gives you a route back up into Cabinet, but you still need those links in the chain of command to reach into the government departments and agencies that really have an influence on housing and neighbourhoods.
Yeah, I think I agree with that, and I think that having somebody in DLUC would send a very strong message. I mean, I'm concerned when I see the latest permitted development suggestions that the needs of children are being completely ignored, and I think it's frightening, really, to think that we are putting children in housing and accommodation for long periods of time, which wouldn't pass normal housing design guidance. So I don't know if you know this, because I think even our industry is not fully aware, that when you count the national the standard sizes for temporary and emergency accommodation, babies aren't counted, so they're physically not seen as a person. So you can house a single parent in a room that's big enough for a single person, but they have their baby there with them, with no space for a cot, no space for anywhere to crawl around. And so, I mean, just on a really simple level, the damage that must be causing that child and that parent and that family in the short term, but also the long term, is profound. So we are kind of rushing through permitted development legislation without thinking about the impact that it's having on children in the here and now and in the long term. And I think we wouldn't be so quick to talk about these things if we hadn't got the thought of children and babies in our mind's eye when we were doing that sort of thing.
Mary, good follow.
Thank you. I'm intrigued by the discussion around the way people used to play and the way that they play now, and obviously the work that you're doing in scrutinising. Of course, many years ago, people felt safer, and children felt safe being out to be able to roam. To what extent have you looked at the perception of safety and the reality of safety in your work?
That's a really interesting question, because I think we do need to look back at some of the housing policy of previous decades. And actually, in the 1950s and 1960s, there was quite a strong emphasis on housing standards and sizes under Parker Morris that was then scrapped. But then you might know that there has been some recently, like in London, we have a London Housing Design Guide. So those things have kind of crept back in. But what the UK was really famous for, and still is the kind of adventure playground movement and sort of playable landscapes. And there was a very kind of positive, I think, attitude towards children being let outside to play. Although there's always been concerns about safety. That's not a new issue. It's definitely not a new issue, and those concerns have changed. And obviously, with cars, that's a very real issue. But I think there was definitely a much clearer sort of consensus, if you like, from national government that these were important parts of housing layouts. And I think where we've gone now is we've sort of lost sight of that a bit, and we've got some kind of very prescriptive standards around play equipment and around kind of playgrounds, and there's been issues with kind of like liability that now kind of concern parents with like having their children unsupervised. And actually really a lot of the conversations they're just kind of not really common sense. I think most people would agree that the idea of children being outside as often as they can be in the natural landscape, playing and exercising and doing all those things is a good thing, but we don't seem to have worked out kind of how to do that and how we can still allow that to happen and keep them safe. And I think things like the sort of creep of this idea of antisocial behaviour, which is often levelled at teenagers who actually just want to play outside as well and are prevented from doing so, or the secure by design measures, which really are kind of like go against a lot of the kind of natural way that children might move around and play. The conversation just doesn't happen together. So we get very worried about safety, but without thinking about what that means for kind of our own freedom. So I think we we need to have this conversation together. We need to think about challenges in, with things like, no ball game signs and all of that. And we really need to sort of unpick it from a child's perspective, I think.
And if I could just take the point on, I think there's actually quite a good news story around safety and perceptions of safety on the very specific topic of playgrounds and playground design. And that's a topic I've been deeply immersed in for well over 20 years. And in short, the story was that around the late 90s, there was a huge focus on safety in playgrounds, almost to the exclusion of every other question. To the point where even playground safety experts were saying, we are building playgrounds that are so monumentally boring that any self-respecting child will go and play somewhere else, right? Mm-hmm. So, I mean, it was kind of, things had got to a very bad state. And those of us in the industry, of whom I was one, realised that this was not good. And we built a kind of, had some tricky conversations, because when you got child safety organisations in the room alongside, play workers and designers, it took a while, but we reached a position where we argued for a balanced approach, that you can't just treat safety in isolation. You have to think about child development and the value for children of giving them some freedom. And not only did we get that consensus, but a few years later we got the Health and Safety Executive to issue a statement in support of it. And actually that has been the key that has unlocked that topic and stopped that pendulum from swinging any further. The 2012 high-level statement from the Health and Safety Executive has opened the door to not just better playgrounds, but for instance, there are programs running in schools now, in school playtimes, with really creative, almost like the old adventure playgrounds from the 60s and 70s. And the school leaders are okay about that. Of course, they're worried about liability and litigation and parents' concerns, but what's helped them make that step into allowing children to have more freedom at playtimes was that leadership from the Health and Safety Executive. So I think there's a really valuable lesson there. We don't have to always follow the culture or the debates around safety. That it is possible to help shape those debates.
Thank you very much. Right, moving on to engagement with the children and young people. Tom.
Thanks. I think it's an interesting point that you made about memories of play and how important they are, because I think not that long ago I moved around quite a lot when I was growing up, and I seem to remember living in this one place for a very long period of time, and I was reminded that I only lived there for 1 year, but it felt like I lived there for about 3 or 4, because that was actually where I played the most.
That's really interesting.
So I guess so it just struck me actually when you said that, and it kind of opened my eyes to actually how important this inquiry is in a way, which is very helpful. Just in terms of engagement, I just with young people, what does good and effective engagement of children and young people look like in practice when considering a built environment?
Okay, so we've been really working in this area for a while now, and I think the first thing is it's really good to hear what you just said about your childhood, and I think I'll come to it in a minute. That's similar conversations that I've had with people, but the best engagement starts at a policy making level, at a local plan making level, at a strategic point where you're really trying to listen to local children and young people about how they are using their local area, what bits work, like you just described, and what bits don't work, and really getting under the skin of that. And that's very rare that we see that kind of work happening and that it being embedded in sort of local plan making. And then after that point, that's when the development industry comes in, and they need to start engaging with children and young people before you start drawing any plans up, before you start deciding, where the housing is going to go, where the schools are going to go, or depending on the size of the project. And I think local people have worked out that box-ticking engagement doesn't work. And actually listening to people's lived experience and listening to children and young people's lived experience is really eye-opening in terms of working out how a space works. It would be interesting if you spoke to your parents about their experience at the time, but what we hear from young people is that they are really very engaged in their local area. In fact, we've got a young person come along with us today who was really keen to witness this inquiry, who we've been working with at Earls Court, where we have a group of people who range from 14 up to 80. So we're working in an intergenerational group where I can tell you now that the adults really enjoy having the young people there, listening to their needs and their wishes, and that's been really transformative for everybody involved. Or it might be reaching out. Another project we're working on is reaching out to parents and carers of under 5s and listening to their needs, and they're often really isolated. They feel like they, at that point of their lives, they barely have an opportunity to get together with other people. So I think there is some. I'm really encouraged in this area. It's been, we've had a big impact considering the size of our practice, and there are awards now around really good engagement with young people. And I go abroad and I talk about the work that we do, and I think in a way the UK should be proud of some of the engagement work that's come out of our democratic process. And you would think that it's all going on in Scandinavia and Holland, but and there were some really good examples, and Tim will talk about them in a minute. But I'm really proud of the engagement that happens in the UK, and I think we need to just not rely on good developers, and there are plenty of good private developers as well as local authorities that want to do this, but there's not enough, and that actually there are unfortunately plenty of not very good developers and house builders who aren't interested at all. So I think we should be positive about it, and so yeah.
Just to sort of, it's interesting what you said about local plans and the importance of local plans. And if we're going to engage young people in influencing local plans. It strikes me because I've been on a planning committee before in a sort of district, and frankly, the average age of a councillor on a planning committee was, well into 60s. I was by far the youngest person on a planning committee, and it was quite a while ago, since I was very young. So it just strikes me as actually if we're going to do that effectively. And actually, it really places a lot of influence in the hands of councillors and local authorities. Do you think, the fact that there's a bit of a challenge when it comes to getting younger people to stand as councillors, to be councillors? In fact, I'm not saying, I'm not suggesting we have 8-year-olds as councillors, but I am suggesting, but frankly, in some areas, you'd be struggling to get a parent of somebody that age being on the council.
Well, we've got the Deputy Youth Mayor for Hammersmith and Fulham here, and we haven't got anyone else on the panel, so we've got one person that's come along from the Public Realm Inclusivity panel at Earls Court, and she happens to be 17. Yeah. So, if you get it right, you would be surprised how engaged and interested young people are. I can tell you the thing that we do, and we do this with adults as well, is that we pay people. It's not about endorsing planning applications and getting consent. It's about valuing people for their time. It's about research and understanding. And in this room today, I'm being paid for my time, as I'm sure all the other adults are. And if you're doing that with communities, they need to be paid for their time as well. And actually, it's a tiny, tiny amount of money, and it shows that you actually care about having them there and that you value their time. And actually, that completely changes the emphasis in the room. Certainly the democratic process isn't about paying people off. That's completely different. But it's about the engagement and how you do care. And so we don't find young people hard to reach at all in that situation.
Can I also just make a plea that figuring out ways to get the adult decision makers to hear directly from children and young people, to actually be in the same room and to have conversations. It's one of the things I've learned from talking to Dinah about her practice, that there is the generations are growing apart to a degree. That there are various social changes that mean young people aren't spending so much time with older people and vice versa. So there's sometimes those gaps in understanding and experience, and so to just have older people hearing young people say what it's like to live in their neighbourhood. Walkabouts are an amazing way to do that. That actually meetings are I'm very happy to be here in this meeting, but meetings are kind of dull, you know. And if you're, never mind 17, if you're 11, they really are dull. But actually having the mayor or you know, a politician out, walking around your neighbourhood with you just for an hour is not dull. I mean, and opens up huge potential for rich conversations and just for breaking down some of those barriers between the generations.
Because I mean, there's been a recent study done by Grosvenor, which I think of 500 young people between the ages of 16 and 18, and it said that 89% had never been asked about what their views were about their local built environment. Only 8% said they'd never taken part in a formal public consultation. Yeah. You know, and so it is concerning. And I remember when I was trying to get a cinema opened up in the area where I lived, because there was nothing for young people to do, and it was a real struggle. Because, you know, initially we were like, we're going to have, because I knew young people wanted a cinema in the area, but then it was just, we had all this opposition from older people who were more used to how to influence these sorts of things, and the letters started coming into the traditional local newspaper, which all the councillors read, and actually battling against that was quite difficult. So, you know, is there something beyond the traditional stuffy public consultation that actually engages young people and makes them feel that they're able to shape those sorts of decisions?
Yeah, we've written a toolkit on how to do it with Grosvenor, because they commissioned that piece of research for that, funded by Sport England. And partly by Grosvenor, but also with the support of the TCPA. And so it's like a really simple, step-by-step, 5 workshops. This is how you start, this is how you work through the process, and this is what you get out of it in the end. So there's definitely techniques you can use to get out of the stuffy meeting situation, for sure.
But the other thing I just want to make a plea for around engagement is, and I hope this is obvious, but you know, we can't rely on children and young people to come up with all the answers, and we can't rely on the participation process alone to come up with you know, to tackle those knotty issues about whether it's about where the cinema goes, or cars, or parking, or green space. We need that adult expertise and commitment alongside bringing in the voices of children.
So just 2 very quick final questions. Firstly, young people who may be neurodiverse. Do you think that's an important aspect of this?
Yes, yeah, and actually they're really good at having conversations about neurodivergence, around disability, around gender, and really understanding that there are a lot of young people out there who feel even more kind of left out and ostracised and vulnerable and victims of crime, and actually incredibly, you know, so the conversations that we have with younger and older people, adults and so on, are much more about inclusivity these days, and I think it's really encouraging that the younger generation are quite keen to have those conversations.
Brilliant. Final question. It's connected to some of the points you're making at the start. Do you think that having a built environment that encourages and facilitates better relations and stronger relationships between young people, because it encourages them to play and spend time with each other, has a knock-on effect in terms of encouraging better relationships between adults? Because their kids play with each other, they meet families, etc. So it's about young people, but actually if we're failing on this, it's not just bad for young people, but it feeds into wider societal problems.
I mean, absolutely. I think when you go to places where children are able to play out, you'll hear from parents who will say, that's where I met the neighbours, when our children started playing outside. That's where I got to know everybody. Now we're on a WhatsApp group. Now I know where the kids are when they've got safe, when I'm worried about where they are. You hear children saying, yeah, this is where we bonded as a community. This is where I got to know other children from other estates, so I feel less scared about walking around locally. And it's about familiarity. It's about kind of sort of engendering a sense of belonging. And, you know, basically if we come outside our front doors, and children are a bit of a glue for playing together, and then we get to know each other, and as the children grow older, you're less fearful of them. You only have to talk to young people who will tell you that actually they're just as interested in their neighbours as they are in their friends. They want to know their neighbours. They want to, you know, some of them will say, this is where we kind of check in on our neighbours and make sure they're okay. So like there's a real sensitivity and a need and a desire to kind of be part of a community when you're growing up.
And I think in the first hearing, the people from Playing Out, the campaign that promotes street play sessions, kind of brought out those connections. But and how that it really does. You can almost see it unfolding through the course of sessions. Certainly, I've attended. People discovering those neighbours, adults discovering connections with each other, and shared interests, and just that kind of network of contact. But I'll also just make one other point, which is that, okay, not everybody wants children outside their house. Sometimes children do irritating things. Children have always done irritating things. We all did irritating things when we were kids, and that's so. I would say that's not a bug in community life. That's a feature. We need to value those. The fact that one of the things that helps children learn how to get along with each other and with the other adults in their community is by just, making mistakes, getting into. I'm not talking about major crime here. I'm just talking about that learning that you get when you do something a bit stupid, and then you have to figure out that you've done that, and those interactions particularly between adults beyond the parents. I mean, parents of course have a role. I'm a parent myself, but that just sort of gritty rubbing along that I can remember from my own childhood. That's not always rosy, but that is a really important formative part of growing up to be a responsible, connected person. That's really important to hold on to, because if it makes you realise that the goal is not the elimination of irritation, right? The goal is to just have communities where people can resolve their differences, not where those differences don't exist, and that goes between the generations as well as in other respects.
Okay, moving on to planning policy, Mary.
Thank you. And Dinah, if I may come to you, just looking at policy and policy decisions, what planning interventions have been employed in the past to address the needs of children and young people, and what lessons can we learn from them?
Yeah, so I mentioned a bit before, didn't I, about the sort of approach to play within the sort of housing standards of the sort of 50s and 60s. And I think that, the much maligned modernist estates of that period, actually, if you imagine a long amount of time that people have lived on those estates, and if you talk to residents, some of them who grew up there and have had children and grandchildren, you often find that when it worked really well from a kind of play perspective. And there were often issues with crime and with poverty and management, but those are alongside some really kind of successful and strong communities that children effectively benefited from a positive attitude towards play. But I think the lessons that can be learned is that we must recognise and understand what was and is happening in those places when they do work, so that when we do regeneration projects and we do create new planning policy, we don't just get rid of the bits that work for children. And I think it also we need to look again a bit at, like I said, this idea of secured by design, which is a kind of police initiative which has been going for. In fact, the Margaret Thatcher was a very big supporter of secured by design, and I think this idea that you can design out crime by kind of effectively, in a lot of instances, kind of gating and fencing everywhere, which makes it very difficult for children to play outside. And I think we need a much more kind of nuanced conversation about the kind of quality of play that children have. What was built and how people are using it, and what might be being built now and how people are using it. So we've got lots of places that we can go to for evidence. We've got lots of history that we can look at, but very little kind of seems to be done in that area.
Of course, many years ago, people would live on terrace streets or single story, double, two-story housing. But tower blocks, etc. They were built with great open spaces in between them. Was that a mistake? Is it actually to do with the way that we build?
I think, well, being a Londoner, I'm quite familiar with what we call the mixed estates. So that quite often what you see when you walk around London is estates that were laid out with tower blocks, with linear blocks that might be sort of lower with what you call deck access on them, and with terraced housing, sort of rows of maisonettes. And the idea behind those mixed estates was that children weren't in the towers. They were in the lower blocks and they were in the maisonettes. But as you probably know, that over the years, what happened is obviously with the right to buy, the sort of tenure changed. But also, you can't sort of decide where people move into. So actually, really, children are often moved into tower blocks, and often there's overcrowding issues. So those weren't really designed for children. And there are a lot of really good estates that were built on a kind of higher density, low rise model. So I think it's not just about tower blocks. It's about yes, they were deliberately laid out to sort of allow this kind of free play to happen, and there were playgrounds, and sometimes they were in the wrong place, and I think we need to sort of learn where those wrong places were. So, like I said, a lot of the deliberate decisions have been slightly changed, if you like.
So deliberate decisions aren't always the best ones.
Yeah, I think it's an endless kind of learning that we need to do in this area.
Organic,
yes.
I guess they call it, don't they?
Yeah.
So what about the here and now then? Current planning policy, is it hindering the objective of improving the health and well-being of children and young people? I just note that the MPPF mentions children once.
Yeah.
They say there's more mention of bats, newts and lorry parking. Is that relevant?
Yeah, I mean, with my other hat on with my hat on as an architect, I can give you examples where I've sat as an advisor on a design review panel. So that's when local authorities, local planning departments ask architects to come in and help give design advice to schemes that are in kind of pre-application stage. And often you might be having a conversation about a play street, for example, that might be kind of being designed into that development, but you're told by the highways officer that the refuse lorry can't make more than one turn on that site, and his, often is a man, word is absolutely final. So that lovely play street that you've just conceived of, with trees and places for children to play football, needs to have a bin lorry driven through it as often as the bin lorry company needs to do that. And actually, you find sort of planning officers' hands are tied in that situation. They can't go against the highways officers' concerns or demands, if you like, and therefore it becomes a kind of sea of tarmac that may or may not get used for play. So I think no is the answer, simply. We just don't have strong enough local policy that make people sit up and think about what children's needs are. It's not really about lots more rules. It's about elevating children to that point where we might sit in a room and say, before we talk about the bin lorries and before we talk about the parking, how are children going to get around this estate? How might they move around without crossing a road? Now let's think about the rest. And so that, to me, is the kind of the way we need to prioritise their needs.
We've touched on it earlier, but in 2018 followed news stories of play spaces segregated by tenure. Planning policy was changed. Were the changes effective?
Well, yes, I think so, because that went into the London plan, and now if you ever sit in a planning meeting and you're looking at the play strategy and the layout of play, everybody will say no segregated play space. Everybody knows that really clearly, and it can't happen. And that has really changed the way that we might put an application together. So there is no kind of gating and fencing. So I think what was interesting about that was it was a real life story, and people could really connect with it. And that, what you were just saying before, Tom, about our real lives, and it's kind of really obvious stuff, isn't it? It's like a developer that I know says, just use very simple terms like, can a child cycle around this development without crossing a road? Like, think about it from the point of view of the 8-year-old or the 14-year-old. It's about making, it's about the power of making those connections back to lived experience. And I would say that that was a really effective change in policy, I think, yes.
Thank you.
Right. Want to we touched on already international comparisons. Ian.
Thanks. It just be for a start, just a couple of reflections on the fantastic evidence you've given. I think that intergenerational conversations is massively important, because when I'm speaking to people who my age, in my 50s now, talk about their life experiences growing up, and you talked about how treasured they are, but also when you speak to children about how lucky what we were like, I think then it sparks, in people's minds, both from a young perspective, but also from an older perspective, when they realise what we actually did and how lucky we were and how different it is now for the children. So I think them conversations are massively important. I'm going to try and do a couple of my constituencies specifically on that, just to start that conversation rolling. And obviously that then can flow into planners. You're a 50-year-old planner and you suddenly think about, well, what was your childhood like? How lucky were you? How much freedom did you have? And also, you've got to invest in the children and listen to them. Look, I was at Wembley yesterday, and I'd be remiss not for me to say the faith that was placed in the youngsters on the pitch reaped dividends. So for me, that's that's just a reflection. That's just a reflection on how important it can be.
He scores.
I have to do that. He's a Chelsea fan. So Tim, just on the international examples, and I was fascinated by your evidence, and I just want to touch on the children's lens and how that's utilised abroad. I've seen some of the examples in Barcelona, we look at Canada, we look at on our own shores through Scotland and Wales who are doing things better. So just from that perspective, can you just explain what that is?
I think so really this is about the rationale. Why is it that some countries, you've mentioned some, and some cities as well, and towns have taken seriously this idea of making their built environment better for children? I think there are three broad rationales. There's the obvious one, which is about children's health, children's well-being, also children's rights. Some countries take children's rights more seriously than we do. So that's one cluster. Then there's a second cluster that really are interested in children because of the links with sustainability and this idea, what does a sustainable neighbourhood look like? Well, it's compact, it's green, it's easy to get around on foot or by bike. It looks a lot like a child-friendly neighbourhood. So there's some cities that and countries that have latched onto that connection. And then there's a third, in a way, perhaps the most interesting group of cities that really take a hard-nosed economic view of this question. These are cities and countries. Japan actually is the best example. Japan is the incredible shrinking country right now. I mean, really the population is dropping off a cliff, and so Japanese politicians and civil servants are really interested in how they can turn that around. And one of the things they're looking at is just how can we make it nicer to be a child? How can we give children a better quality of life? And also, of course, help parents. There's a whole lot of stuff around that, but. They've realised that a city or a country that cannot kind of make a good offer to children and families is a place whose long-term future is pretty bleak. So that's the three rationales. But the really interesting thing is that there are some cities and countries that are talking about two or even all three of those. So they're seeing win-wins or even win-win-wins by joining the dots between, the demographics, sustainability, health and well-being. And I think what that highlights is we should not see that a kind of economic imperative is opposed to an imperative around health and child well-being. Properly understood, especially if looking at the long term and kind of the need to build a collective vision, they're actually going in the same direction. And you see that. I think maybe the best example is Tirana. I mean, I don't suppose Tirana often gets a mention as a kind of beacon of good practice. It's an amazing city. I mean, it's a wonderful city to visit, but it was a broken city in the aftermath of Albania's communist collapse and then the kind of chaos that ensued. And so the mayor of Tirana really kind of initially almost by chance realised that talking about children and almost building up children as a symbol of the future of the city was a way to transcend some of those really deep political and socio-cultural divisions, and so now he's running and his team are running programmes and playgrounds, cycle lanes, city parks, an urban forest, school streets, and a lot of it just gets drawn back to we're doing this for our children, and that it's part of what makes Tirana a city with a future and a city that's got hope, is that we're placing this focus on children. It is incredible to see.
Sort of answered the questions really, and it's really interesting. I think we should go there, by the way, to see that, because that sounds fascinating. So from a UK national policy and legislation, how far are we lagging behind places like Tirana?
Yeah.
How far are we lagging? And from nation states as well?
Yeah. So, okay, you've got Wales and Scotland.
Yeah.
And I know in a sense that they're a bit outside of your terms of reference in this committee, as I understand it. But you know, obviously we want to learn from what's happening. And they are both, in both of those devolved administrations, there is some serious attention being paid to this topic. In Wales, there's a process called place efficiency. So every local authority has to basically kind of look at what it's doing for children's play and figure out how to improve children's opportunities for play. And then in Scotland, there are various planning reforms, including kind of focus around children's participation, and also linking back to the UN Convention. And I know that's also a hot topic. So leaving aside Wales and Scotland, in England, yeah, that kind of vision and political conversation is just not happening. There are some interested agencies we've mentioned already, but we haven't left the starting block. And I really hope that this committee will play a part in being a catalyst for those conversations to happen, because we need it.
So just touching on catalyst, I've seen some of the work that Dean and both you've been doing with the mayors. So obviously the London Mayor, and also Andy Burnham was featured in one of the books as well. Is that a potential catalyst as well, the devolved powers and places like that, where we could actually see things happen?
Yeah. I think that London is a bit of a beacon, actually, internationally, in terms of having the London Plan has a whole section on play and informal recreation, and there's a space standards of 10 square metres per child requirement on new developments. And I think because of that focus, even though it can be very, very hard to achieve on a high density development, and I say that with all the absolute will in the world, working on these developments, it's very difficult to do, but it focuses the mind. And actually, I think where we've got to now in London is the next level, which is to really think about, it isn't just about spaces, it's about what kind of spaces, where they are, how you get to them. And I think the conversation now, because the policy's in place and has been in place for a good 14 years, I think since 2008, means that we've got, we're able to have a more nuanced conversation about this. But we do obviously have other pressures within the London Plan. So, we shouldn't rest on our laurels. We need to do more. We need to see where that's being delivered or not being delivered, and we need to look at kind of, what it's like 10 years down the line. So, yes, we should be encouraged by that, but I think that doesn't let the government off the hook, if you know.
And I think obviously I look forward to recommendations which you make, but just to finish, you touched on, Tim, about the importance. Sometimes this is subjects obviously rushed to one side, we see council budgets slashed, and it's getting it politically right at the top of the agenda. And you touched on the elements before, reading today about an obesity crisis, and also that's the well-being of the country, that's future generations, that's what the country's going to look like in decades to come if you don't solve the problems now. And that was aired in the earlier panel as well, before your good selves. So it's how we shape the importance of this subject and make it a political hot potato and make it really relevant in decision makers' minds, and hopefully you can help with that with some recommendations.
I think it's the vision for housing. I think that we need a vision for what housing looks like across this country, and this paints a really good picture for what it could look like for everybody, for future generations, because quite frankly, houses in a sea of tarmac, and that's what you see when you go around the country from the train and from your car, are failing, completely and utterly failing for children.
And
go on.
Well, I was just going to say, it's one of the few things that everybody seems to agree about. No matter where you are on the political spectrum, you agree that the housing that we're delivering is I'll just use the word mediocre, shall I? And so, yeah, a new vision is really needed. And it seems to me that, I've said it before, but this is complicated stuff, right? You speak to any planner. I mean, planning is almost a definitive wicked issue because there's all these, different factors coming into play, different points of intervention, even, priorities. It's always politically, it's tough. So having a way of overcoming some of that complexity and navigating it, and maybe through the other side getting some kind of consensus, or at least a sort of some starting points, is really valuable. And it really does seem, I would say this, wouldn't I, but talking about children, because of the fact that you're thinking about whole life and how children's lives can pan out, and because we do take some collective responsibility for children, rightly, that has real power in figuring out how to make planning work better.
Thanks, yeah.
So we all agree we ought to do things better, but how do we know once things have been done whether they really are better? How do we evaluate them properly?
Well, it's an interesting question. We talk about it in architecture quite a lot. We talk about post-occupancy evaluation, and it's very rarely done, and I think there's lots of reasons for that. I think what's interesting is when you do look at evaluation, when you do look at studies, they're almost always adult-focused. They're asked of adults about adults' needs. I did this morning actually just check in on what's called the annual resident satisfaction survey that's carried out by the major house builders, written by the Home Builders Federation and the National House Building Council, the NHBC, who funded that first piece of research. And it's really interesting what the questions that are asked of residents that buy into new developments. And really it's just focused on the kind of quality and the design of the home itself. And it doesn't stretch to anything really about the neighbourhood. It's about what was your experience like when you bought a house. So it's a bit like you're buying a fridge or a washing machine. And did the phone get answered quickly when you called them? But it's bizarre, isn't it? Because when you look at new developments for sale, the image that you always see is one of a happy person living a great life. Often there's children playing outside, really often. And that really speaks to us, because deep down inside, that's what we're buying. We're buying health and happiness. We're not really that bothered as much about, it turns out, whether we have a south-facing garden, as whether it's a neighbourhood that children can play out in. And I know that because I got that question squeezed into the UK Green Building Council's study of 3,000 people, and it turned out that if you ask that question, it is really important. We just don't ask it. It's a really, and even more interestingly, that question was even desirable for people who don't have children, because it is a description of a good place that we all recognise. But we don't ask those questions, and so we essentially the house builders are patting themselves on the back and failing at the same time. So I think we could do a lot more on evaluation that could really help us. There are some really good examples. There's schemes outside London, there's Port Loop in Birmingham, there's a scheme that we worked on in Buckinghamshire, there's Goldsmith Street that won the Sterling Prize. Lots of these developments are built with the idea of children being able to play out, and they're really well loved by the residents.
And on that note, if I could just mention one scheme that I think might be worthy of the committee's attention, that's Chobham Manor, quite a high profile, one of the first parts of the Olympic site to be developed, where there's just, I think a year ago, a really detailed post-occupancy evaluation. It did just speak to the adults, but what was interesting was that, well, two things. Firstly was that development, Chobham Manor, was designed as a child-friendly development. It was really, it's unusual in that was kind of up front a really important part of the whole goals of the scheme, and because it was effectively, there was a strong public hand in it, it actually saw that through. And secondly, and just to back up what Dinah said, the evaluation was very positive, and in particular what leapt out to the evaluation team was the the development has a linear park running through the centre of it, and the feedback and the analysis of what the residents were saying was that it was the beating heart of the development. It was where kids played. There were allotment spaces there. People who didn't have children valued it just as much as those who did, and the whole development as a whole scored more highly in terms of people liking it and wanting to stay there and saying they would stay there, more than 5 years than the London average. And families with children particularly valued it. So it goes to, I think, I can't remember if it came up in the first hearing, but this idea, I'll steal it from Enrique Peñalosa, the former mayor of Bogotá, this idea of children being an indicator species. And it's not, I don't think it's not just a slogan. I think it's actually a real statement about what makes neighbourhoods good places.
It's all very good, and there's some good examples. But it's the reality that developers, architects, planners don't do this as a matter of course. They don't go back and say, this is what we've built, this is what we helped develop. They don't go back and check whether people actually like living there. Do they clear children? Do they actually follow the NPPF, government's ambition to create a healthy, inclusive and safe place? Or is that just the occasional example you can give us rather than the regular?
No, they don't. And our industry, our profession has been kind of asking for it for years. But I think, if I'm going to be, in all fairness, I think it's quite a hard question to ask, because it's really hard to, I think they shy away from comparing themselves to each other. So I think in some respects it would be a really good place for government to start doing proper research, so independently, actually looking at it, rather than expecting them to mark their own homework, if you like. Actually, we should be doing it as a country and checking what we need and what we want. Otherwise, there's a tendency to kind of fall on whatever whim is in place. So I think we should, but perhaps in a different way.
Very quick follow-on, actually. You've preempted me there, Chair. Should there be a requirement then on developers over a certain size, developments over a certain size, to conduct post-occupancy evaluations?
Well, I think I've come round to thinking I'm not sure whether we can keep asking them to do that and keep failing to get it. Actually, what we need is really good and well laid out places, and maybe we need to just do more research about what that is and demand that they do that and build really good examples so that they can feel encouraged to do it them as well and confident that it works.
Right. Thank you both very much for coming and giving the committee a lot of interesting information and evidence, which I'm sure we're going to reflect on. So it can be quite an eye-opening inquiry for most of us, I think, bringing new issues to light that perhaps there shouldn't be new issues, but there's clearly are issues that haven't been well addressed in the past. So thank you very much indeed for coming to meet with us this afternoon. And we're on to our second panel now.
Juice here, sorry.
Oh, actually, right, I just say.
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Yes, we were down to 2.
Or it again. Yeah, that's fine.
He's got the next questions after me. Okay, thank you very much for coming. And could I just ask you to begin this session by introducing yourselves and who you're representing today, and just go down the table. Good. Sarah.
Sarah Scannell. I'm an Assistant Director of Planning. I work currently at Birmingham City Council, but I'm here representing an interested party as a professional planner.
Jo McCafferty. I'm an architect and a director of Levitt Bernstein Architects. We have 120 staff across 2 studios in London and Manchester, and we're architects, urban designers and landscape architects, which is particularly relevant for this topic today. I've worked in housing, particularly over the last 25 years, working in the UK and Ireland, but I also advise lots of local authorities and private developers on housing design and quality standards, and was lucky enough to be co-author of the edition of the Housing Design Handbook, which is guidance which features a lot of case studies with regard to exemplary housing in the UK and Europe.
Hi, I'm Jonny Anstead, co-founding director of Town. We're an SME housing developer. We built a scheme called Marmalade Lane, which has been featured by the Better Building Beautiful Commission and fairly extensively through good guidance practice notes nationally and at local levels. I'm also the chair of the Quality of Life Foundation, which is the charity that promotes well-being and healthier placemaking in the built environment, and with a focus on research and post-occupancy evaluation in particular.
Right, so let's come back now. Again, we're back to good schemes being highlighted, but just begin with Jonny. I mean, the reality is developers seem to face challenges that they can't overcome, or don't manage to overcome, or won't overcome, in actually building better environments for children and young people. Is that a fair description?
It's definitely the case that developers find it difficult to build good urban environments, full stop, including for children. So I wanted to sort of start off by putting this in the context of a much wider quality issue that we have nationally, which is about children, and with children being the indicator species, it makes sense that they would be at the receiving end of a kind of a wider problem of quality. The 2020 housing design audit for England, which was a piece of work undertaken by the Place Alliance, found that that new housing development across the country was overwhelmingly mediocre or poor in large extent, and it identified a lot of particular problems, which included design of highways, the layout of bins and parking, a lack of character of place, including particularly green spaces, problems around the design of streets, and a lack of walkability. And it's no coincidence that those are all the same kinds of issue that we're talking about in determining whether a place is good or not for children. So firstly, it's part of a much wider problem. From a developer's perspective, I think there is a problem in that very, very little is expected of us through the planning system. And we're generally encouraged to think about the needs of children as a kind of tick box activity. As you'll be aware, the policy requirements on us through a planning application will principally be around the incorporation of local areas of play or local equipped areas of play, which have the effect of reducing the needs of children down to the provision of a small playground with a fence around it. And that's very convenient for developers in that it's very, very cheap. It takes up very little space. You can buy it off the shelf, and it's very easy to incorporate within a very standardised housing estate layout. It doesn't really require us to do anything different. And it really falls short of what's required in terms of actual outcomes for children. It doesn't really do very much. And all the things that have been talked about around, in particular, safety, mobility, the freedom to move around independently, to cultivate relationships with your peers from young ages, to grow in independence and have your needs met in different ways as you progress through your childhood, are clearly not going to be met by a 3x3 metre or playground with a ride-on toy. It's just it's so far from the reality of what's going to make a difference. So I think a big problem is that there's a kind of reductive approach where we're sort of made to think, and it's convenient for us to think, that is basically meeting the needs of children. For those of us who, for whatever reason, do wish to do more, and I should point out that doing more is a sort of voluntary thing. Often we're not required to do more, but we as a company do try and think about it in a more thoughtful and considered way. We hit real challenges, and some of them have already been mentioned today. The kind of things that we'd be looking to do might be around reducing the impact and the dominance of cars in a neighbourhood, or and creating safer streets where children can play, where there's a kind of sense of independence, surveillance, but where children have from quite a young age the ability to play out on the doorstep and to do all those things that have been talked about through this inquiry. Now, when we promote those sorts of ideas, we hit the various technical challenges that have been hinted at today. One is that the Waste Collection Authority may find it challenging because it may mean a slightly more difficult or unorthodox way of collecting refuse. In other words, it might need to be, for example, communal refuse solutions rather than wheelie bins outside every home. Another might be that the local highways authority may find the approach irregular because it may conflict with the prioritisation of cars, which is the principal interest of the local highways authority. So the path of least resistance is really to create a layout that is very, very good for refuse and very, very good for highways. And in doing so, you create an environment which is very, very poor for children. As a development company, we're, stubborn and mission-driven. So we sometimes, push for what we consider to be a better outcome for people, including for children. But I can totally understand why a lot of companies and other developers wouldn't. So I think it's not an exaggeration to say that we're encouraged to think more about bins and cars than we are about children in the way that we approach our projects.
One follow-up question, I'll come back to the other two witnesses. So, can or should developers be incentivised then to look after the needs of children, to predict what they are, to try and find out what they are, rather than having the current situation where they seem to be ignored?
Developers should definitely do more and be made to do more through incentives or through regulations. I think that, being really honest, this is tied up with the structure of the house building industry, and this is something for you, I guess, to consider in the context of whether carrots or sticks are the appropriate approach. But you have a house building industry which is principally made out of volume house builders who, as you know, develop, the top 10 companies develop over 50% of our housing stock annually. And that model is absolutely driven by short-term profit and cost control. So I think we need to do a lot to change that kind of cultural approach. We need to see more examples of good practice. Marmalade Lane is a scheme that we've been involved with, Goldsmith Street, but those examples, unfortunately, are, they're sort of, you can count them on one hand. And we need to see more examples being brought forward in order to sort of set a sea change in the industry.
Okay, so I'll come back to witnesses. I haven't forgotten about you, but just you say, okay, then you've got to get away from this simply driven by profit. But we know that, and we've had evidence at previous inquiries, that if a developer doesn't make 20% return on capital, the house doesn't get built. So that's why we get slow build out very often on our site, because at that point, the amount you can get for that property falls below the 20% level, so it doesn't get built for some time. So that's the model. How do you change that model? That's a pretty fundamental thing. It's not just about asking a few children what they like. It's a whole change to the model, isn't it?
But that is the problem that we're facing. And only today the Competition and Markets Authority has published a report into exactly this in house building, which has said there is not enough quality, there's very little innovation in the sector, and also that the sector is building out in a way that suits its own methods of production more than responding to the real needs of consumers. So you don't have it's true that you don't have your starting point isn't a fully kind of correctly functioning market. So I think yes, it is a problem. With all that being said, it doesn't. A lot of the things that we're talking about don't necessarily need to cost that much more. There are different ways of thinking about the way space is used. At Marmalade Lane, we've slightly changed the way that parking is laid out. We've put parking to the edge of the development and put it into a shared parking area. That's actually freed up space. It means that, just purely from a commercial point of view or an economics point of view, we've reduced the amount of space given over to car parking from around 36% to around 12%. So that actually is cheaper to lay out. There's less tarmac, there's less hard surfacing. It's really a different way of doing things. It's not necessarily a more expensive way of doing things.
Okay. Sarah, Joe, who wants to come in? No.
Well,
I
think. Do you want perhaps if we talk about some more examples of good practice? I think sort of building on Jonny's point, another aspect of context is the fact that in terms of architects involved in designing housing, only 6% of new homes in the UK are in fact designed by architects. So you can see from that figure alone that in fact that the design profession and those with expertise are not really involved in those projects very much. And so therefore, looking again at the involvement of young people and the requirement of and the desire of all of us to involve young people in that's even less. So we're talking about best practices of such a small percentage of overall. But there are, as we've just been touching on, and Dinah and Tim before us have said, there are examples of good practice, and we just need support to build more of those. For example, working in Poplar as a practice, we've been working there on an estate for the last 12 years, and there the whole design team have been engaged with almost over 100 children and working with 100 children from 2 local schools and really rethinking how the new development can work there for children and young people. And that's shown us, the thing that Jonny's touching on is this issue that some of it doesn't cost very much, some of it is just attention to detail. And the wonderful thing about working with children and young people is that they really get both the strategic and the detail. So they understand the importance of the position of a gate or pairing of an entrance so that you meet your neighbour and you can play out in the mornings easily, but your parent can watch you from the kitchen window. They understand that detail and they want to talk about it. But they also understand the importance of strategic aspects of design that are, again, probably don't cost much money, but just need to be thought about in the design process. So, for example, where the cycle routes are, where the pedestrian routes are, how you can remove car spaces from right outside an area of play so that you can directly run out, as Dinah was describing earlier, run out of your front door and into that play area and into that play space and meet your friends and go and call on your neighbour without crossing too many roads. So those things don't actually cost much money, but they do need a really different approach to design thinking. And it also requires a real teeth in the planning process for everyone to think about things in that way. I can certainly say that having worked in housing for the last 25 years, I can count on this hand the number of times that a pre-app meeting or a design review panel, I've been asked about the experience of children in the design that I'm putting forward. It never happens, and it certainly never filters through to a planning committee. So it is so absent from that conversation, and that's why we need policy to change that.
Sarah.
So at that juncture, probably right that the planner comes in and starts talking about, what is the reality of it? Why isn't it that we're talking about it? I think you've heard a bit already about the importance of the local plan.
Yeah, we're going to come on to local plans in a minute. Yeah, so, yeah.
And I think it does come down to what is it that as a society we are requiring of our local authorities, and what policies is it that we want people to bring forward? And how do we engage with that? How do we get young people to contribute to those processes? So I'm happy to go into talking about local plans now if you want to.
We'll come back to that in a
Okay,
second.
that's fine.
Right. Can we move on to the whole issue of design and participation? Ian.
Thanks, Chair. Just a job. How can architects design good built environments for children and young people if, as you said, they don't listen to them?
Well, I think it's such a powerful question. It is by listening. It's about involving children and young people in the design process, and it's not it's not just to think forward in terms of what they might need going forward, but it's also from the get-go to really understand the spaces and the environment that they currently live in from their perspective. So not only the external space, but also the buildings they use and how they use them and how they might fail that community or how they work well. So really deeply understanding the space from their perspective and the community from their perspective, that neighbourhood is the first thing to do, and to really deeply listen. And then I think then building on that, really thoroughly understanding their needs in the design of the new proposals from that conversation. So you open up that conversation on site with young people and with children in using different methods. There are lots of toolkits around. ZCD Architects, one that Dinah described earlier, the Voice Opportunity Power toolkit we've used a lot. And it's really powerful just to sort of unpack that listening process a little bit more. So how that works is that essentially you ask a group of young people, different ages, so you can take primary school children, secondary school children, a mix or separately. You ask them to score the spaces in their local neighbourhood. So from a red, amber, green scoring. Spaces that they feel great in and they feel really safe in, spaces that they feel really deeply uncomfortable in. And it starts drawing out a conversation as to why that is, where they play, where they meet their neighbours, where they meet their friends, what their route to school is as well. You know, kind of that draws out conversations with regard to that. And then you take that same scoring system and you go to a new development, so somewhere possibly close to where they live or a little bit further away, and you do the same thing again. And that's really powerful because it then starts a conversation about, okay, so what place might you feel comfortable in this new development, or if your environment is going to be redesigned. And then from there, that group of young people, they create a manifesto for their new neighbourhood. And we've talked about that a lot in planning discussions recently at the pre-app meetings, which I was mentioning, those conversations weren't happening. We kind of put that manifesto on the table saying, this is actually what a group of young people living in this area want for their environment. And it wakes everybody up in the room. There's nothing more powerful than the kind of anecdotal that's fed through the sort of lens of childhood. And
that's all absolutely fantastic. But as Clive said, the chair, with regards to systemic framework, what we've got now, which it's not open to that at the moment, is it? So what recommendations, what would we need to get what you're talking about there actually hardwired into the system and change the culture? So the houses that are getting built now are actually future-proofed. So they've actually got what we need and what children need, more importantly.
I think it has to be a planning requirement. I think that when you put a planning application in, you have to set out and give evidence of what process you've gone through with children and young people in that neighbourhood. And it has to be very detailed. You have to really set out the questions you've asked, the responses you've got, what that manifesto is that forms part of an architect and landscape architect's brief at the beginning of a project. And it's not only securing that through the planning process and making sure that then that evidence is looked at by the planning officers that are reviewing an application. It goes to a design review process for the DRPs that are reviewing those, and it's also discussed at committee. But also in terms of the planning conditions, there is a requirement for that ongoing dialogue with children and young people to happen.
So it's hardwired throughout the system.
Absolutely, and that point about how do you hardwire post-occupancy evaluation, going back, checking whether something's working, well, that has to be hardwired into those planning conditions.
Brilliant answer. Is there any examples of architects working with young children, good examples which has improved the design of a housing scheme or a public space?
Lots, and I know I would say this, but we're working on lots. But lots of other great people are too. But they're just across the country. There aren't. I can pinpoint examples. I talked about our work in Poplar, which is really not only shaped. What's been really interesting there is it's not because we were talking about strategic things and detail at the same time. So it's really shaped even the positioning of buildings and how open spaces and play areas and movement patterns are all stitched together and how they're connected. So it's not just saying that, a discussion around the design of play equipment in a specific kind of ring-fenced area. It's a much
but the impact is much bigger on the design, where the cores are into a housing development, how people come and go from their homes, how front doors are organised and close to each other, the height of a boundary wall, all of those sorts of things can be impacted from that conversation.
Can you just make a quick observation or a quick question as well as regard, it is a class issue as well, so for the states that it costs more money, would the children be listened to, would that be factored in more so than say a council housing estate that's being built, if we were lucky enough to get one built? Is it a class issue?
I think that's a really, really good question. I think it's interesting. I think if you give an opportunity for children to be involved in a process, they will come. I mean, Dinah said this earlier, there's a thirst from young people and children to be involved in this process. So you're pushing an open door, but you have to value young people's time in that process. And as was mentioned earlier, one way of doing that is also paying them for that time. So
maybe I can ask Jonny that. Is the class issue, Jonny?
I think we're pretty consistent in not doing across most housing what Joe has described. So I'm not sure that we're better in nationally. I'm not sure we're better in one context versus another. I think we're pretty consistent. To say that's the positive, I suppose. We've been doing some of this work as well, going into schools, working with a charity or a not-for-profit called Block Builders to do Minecraft-based consultation, which is great. You know, kids of sort of year 5 to year 9 planning an urban regeneration project in Wolverton and Milton Keynes, and there's huge benefit all round because they get excited and it's interesting. They think about it in a totally different way. Their thinking is far less preempting what they think adults must think about. So they don't arrive at the things that adults hardwire to immediately, which is very restrictive. They start off with a very expansive perspective on what's possible, and they look at a street and say, look, we'd like it to be, great for play and have water down it and trees. Adults would never say that because there's a sort of sense of this is what a road is, this is what a street is. But also it means that we can engage with wider community through that process, so their parents become involved in a process. So it helps with that wider sort of sense of participation. I think it would be good if it was a requirement for that kind of type of thinking to be added into what's already a requirement in a sort of statement of community involvement, but to specifically say that you should have been...
As a developer, you wouldn't have any problem with it being hardwired into the planning process?
From our point of view as a developer, because this is something that we believe in and we think drives better... So we're a profit with purpose developer, so we are committed to doing this anyway, but we're often at a disadvantage in situations where others would take the path of least resistance and do as little as possible. From our point of view, it's an advantage if there's a level playing field, and the requirements of various sorts are kind of baked into the process, because it means that not just us but other SMEs who are quality driven can compete more effectively.
Sarah, anything you'd like to add?
Just from my experience, the examples of this being done very well go from the big developer with a multi-million pound investment to an HRA who might be developing a social housing site. So I don't think it is a class issue. I think it is much more systemic.
Yeah. Moving on to local planning. Andrew.
Thank you. So just start with Sarah and then maybe broaden out. When local authorities are creating their local plans, how do they typically account for the needs of children and young people, and how do those that are better at it do so? What's the difference? And just a little personal aside, have you noticed any difference between unitary authorities that have children and young people's responsibilities as well being any better at this, or is that not really a factor?
I think when we talk about the local plan, we're talking about what is it that's required in a local plan. So you've got to look at the NPPF, and as you've heard already today and from the last session, there is very little evidence about where children are spoken about in the whole. So what the children are considered in local plans at a very high level. Are there enough school places for them? Are there enough doctors? Do they have the right size house? It very, very, very rarely goes into the detail of the qualitative assessment that we're talking about here that we need to see. And whilst there are some pockets of some really good examples of that, that is where the local authority has taken it upon themselves to go hard on an issue, have a policy that's particularly about requiring a qualitative or a larger assessment. Mostly, we see it's about, if it's anywhere, there's a quantum of space.
Sorry.
Just adding some
you
drama.
need a child to help you with it, Andrew. I think that's
Got one. Got one. Thank you. There we go.
I think most of the time, where you see it perhaps as a quantum of space that's required per house or per child space that's created. There are very, very few examples where there's a qualitative aspect to that. And I think really importantly, it comes to what's written in stone about how you consult on the local plan. There is no, this stretches wider than this topic, but there is no minimum requirements for engagement. So there is no requirement for an authority to demonstrate that a certain amount of people in any protected characteristic have commented or been engaged on local plan development. So what we're missing there is a real genuine understanding of what people on the whole of a space want.
Do you think local authorities only ever do things if people in Whitehall tell them that they must do so, rather than being local elected members who might want to take some initiative themselves?
I think when you look at the development space at the moment, it's extremely tight. You're seeing developments come through that are only barely viable most of the time, and as we've talked about this profit, it's difficult to get. We're not, I think we're pretty confident that it's difficult to get development through. So when you come to a planning space as someone who's assessing planning applications, what you have is the right to assess the things that are at the top of the list. And at the moment, that's a big list. We've been adding to the planning requirements steadily over 20 years, so it's quite a big ask. And at the moment, you're seeing things like affordable housing being top of the list, zero carbon being top of the list, biodiversity net gain, nutrient neutrality. They are all the hot topics. To get to the level where we're talking about designing stuff from a children's perspective, we need that to be written in the MPPF, and we need that to be translated to local plans, because at the moment there is so much other things that the planning system is trying to fix.
Well, you're reading my mind there, because I was going to say that I'm a little unsettled by ideas of post-planning analysis, and especially special requirements for this and that, given that we're always hearing that we haven't got enough planning officers, the viability problems, there's a massive housing shortage. So given that you've already said that planning officers have a very limited scope to assess these particular needs of young people that we've talked about, rather than the broader strategic issues of school places and so on, and therefore within the system we've got, this is looking difficult without placing just additional layers of process that we've spent 20 years doing, as you correctly say. Is your conclusion in terms of planning policy for this that our whole approach to planning and what planning is needs to change, rather than just adding yet another layer to an already overloaded system?
I think we're at a moment in time in planning, in the planning regime, we're looking at a new kind of process that we do planning within. So I think there's an opportunity to capitalise on that. You've heard people give evidence about the National Model Design Code, which looks at how we will change how we plan places. That actually takes a step away from just looking at some policies on a page and looking how they translate to the physical presentation of it. So I think things like how we plan for children and young people in a design space will come to policy quickly, because it could be in the National Model Design Code. There's parts in it already, but it needs to be enhanced with a qualitative assessment about the space that exists already and how new places will be designed to allow children and young people to move adequately between the places that they go to, or that their spaces are more, what is it that we want from that scheme, rather than you need 5 square metres per unit to make it work. We've also got, the development management policies that are, we're told, are going to be part of the new planning regime, which set policies across the country. There would be an easy win to make one of those policies that there's a children and young people approach to how we're planning new developments.
And would you think children and young people's needs in planning policy would be enhanced by some inclusion of that for local members in planning committees, or would it just be one of those required sections in the planning application that you sort of flick through before you get to what the application is itself, and actually needs a bigger change than that?
I think having the vision in the MPPF is key to ensure that it isn't just a tick box, that it's actually that we change the dial, that when you're looking at schemes, the first thing that planners are asking you at pre-app is tell us how you've designed this to be future-proof, because ultimately designing it for children and young people means that it's designed for the future population of our country. This is fundamental stuff that should be happening but isn't because of all the other things that we've piled in. So I think that when it gets to planning committee, what at the moment people have sat on planning committee, the things that you're considering are the things that are in your inbox and what your commitments are. And actually they are affordable housing, they are zero carbon, they are the things that are at the top of that list. We need to get children and young people's perception and the way that they experience design and place to be at the top of that list.
I suppose this is just a distinction between fighting for two or three other things, ageing population, net zero, etc., and redesigning a system so all of these things sort of follow through. So both in terms of where we are now, but also perhaps some reflections on what a better system would be, all three of you. What impact in changes in planning policies within our framework now do you believe would require developers to do better, and also that wider piece about changing the way we do things as well? And start with Jonny and work that way this time.
Yes, working within what's plausible or possible within the system that we have. I think, a tangible example is that we're currently working on a development proposal for Hartree, which is a planned urban extension to Cambridge, 5,500 homes, where we're master developer alongside Landsec, U&I. And as master developer, we've got a long-term vested interest in the quality of that place over the next 20 plus years. So we've got a huge interest in making sure that the quality is there. So we're preparing a strategy there, which is all about creating a place that's child-friendly and that passes the tests that we've been talking about. Now, we're doing, as I've said before, we're sort of doing that off our own bat, and finding the starting point for such a piece of work isn't all that easy, because there isn't a national sort of framework or statement around what good practice looks like, and there's a lack of guidance. So we have started by looking at the sort of UN Convention on Rights of a Child and translated that into tangible things that can be done. So what impact do those top level aspirations have on street layout, movement of children safely, mobility, all those other things. What would be easier for us is if at a national level and then cascading down into a local level, there was a sense of what good looks like in terms of creating a place that's good for children. And it would mean that would become an easier task for us and for any developer looking at it to be able to put together an audit of our or a justification of our proposals, to almost like a checklist to say, right, here's our proposals, here's how, following a sort of national framework, this meets the needs of children. And I think that could easily be coordinated with the with design codes. And and if you get that right at the national level, it seems to me that at local level it could be adapted to local circumstances, bearing in mind that I think places are all different. But having some consensus around what the starting point is and what the overall objective is would help developers to sort of start with a degree of certainty that A, this is encouraged by government and it's important. B, we have an understanding of what is required. And C, we're all going to be measured in the same way, and there'll be an easier route through planning by doing these things well.
I'm biased because I'm chairman of the all-party group for SME house builders, but isn't there a concern that you'll lose some of your USP if everybody's required to be good, rather than you being able to say, I really know what I'm doing here and can give you a quality product?
From a citizen's point of view, I think that this agenda is incredibly important, and in preparing for this session today, I was drawn to the World Health Organization's social determinants of health, which point to the built environment, homes, and early childhood as being, 2 of the 10 social determinants of health, which are basically the things that drive people's health and well-being as a nation. which are not about interventional medical care. So it seems to me that as a sector, we as developers have an incredibly important role to play, because what we do, for good or bad, is going to determine people's health, people's well-being, and not just today, but for decades and generations to come, because what we build has a habit of sticking around for many, many years. And so I think that we have to sort of see that as being a sort of an imperative nationally, that this should be raised up the agenda. But speaking from a business owner's point of view, I think that cultivating a general expectation that things should be better is no bad thing for companies who are trying to do a good job.
Thank you.
I think just sort of building on what Jonny said, there is a specific aspect that we haven't really covered, but I think it's important for everyone to know that within policy at the moment, with regard to play provision within housing, the focus of policy is around designated play and areas for designated play activities, and we can probably have a very long conversation about what that might mean. But essentially, a lot of it, as has been described in this discussion, is around quantum of play space, and something that we constantly come up against as architects and designers working in, particularly in high density development, but actually across the board, is that actually playable landscape, so appraising a whole development from its play perspective and opportunities, and obviously that coming from the hopefully a much better engagement process with children and young people, that is never given value in the planning process in terms of quantum. So you can design the most fantastic development with lots of playable landscape and opportunity for play, but without specific designated play, and it won't count for anything. And I think it's just really important that actually, if there's one aspect that can help a much more joined-up conversation with creating better opportunity for young people and children in housing development, it's that shift in thinking and that kind of shift in placing value in playable landscape as well as specifically designated play. And that's a relatively small shift in policy, but would have a really big impact.
Okay.
I think all the hooks, there are hooks in our existing system that can, if emphasised and if given the right focus nationally, can achieve all our aims. The MPPF talks about active communities that are engaged, that have great walking routes and active travel is a focus. And the National Model Design Code does talk that design in a play space has to be done in conjunction and in consultation and with communities. So I think it's about having that vision that comes and that strong, clear narrative that these things will be taken to the next level, and that what we need is these hooks in the MPPF. They exist, but we will be requiring detailed analysis and qualitative analysis to be accompanying planning applications going forward.
I mean, that just takes me back before I conclude, sorry, Chairman, that if that requires detailed quality analysis and we are short of housing, your point, Jonny, about health determinants, there's no better health determinant than actually having a house rather than having incredibly detailed policies that means we don't do very many of them, but they're really good if we do. So how do you square that circle?
I mean, it's I do understand the tension and the challenge that you're faced with, but I think that we shouldn't be in a position where we're offering people a bad house or no house at all, or you know, it's not a fair, you know, it's not a sensible way to be looking at housing provision nationally. We have to get to grips with the fact that we do need to provide houses, but that the houses that we need to provide have to be good, and the neighbourhoods that we have to provide need to be good as well. And I think there's a risk that we buy into a narrative around, well, you know, this is all very hard. You can't have decent housing. You're lucky that we're providing housing at all. I think it's the wrong way of looking at things. I think we should be saying, no, we need to have both. We need to have the quantity of housing, but we also need to make sure that not just that it's in the right place, but actually that it's very good and that it's set out in neighbourhoods that actually support people's health and well-being. That should be a bare minimum.
I think squaring my circle is that the current system is not delivering both of those desirable things. But I think I've heard a bit of that from you as well. Thank you, Chairman.
Okay, we've got 2 follow-ups from Tom and then Mary.
Thanks. I sort of touched upon this question earlier on, and I know it's sort of a slightly sensitive topic, but I mean, I've been on a planning committee myself, and I've never heard this mentioned at all. And I was on a planning committee for about 1.5 years, 2 years. My dad is actually a chair of a planning committee, and he's 78. So he's an elderly chap, chairs the planning committee, and it just strikes me that there isn't as much diversity as perhaps as we'd like when it comes to councillors, and in age in particular, that's a challenge. And I think one of the dangers of this is that when it comes to planning applications, things are seen from one perspective, from a perspective of homeowners, from a perspective of people who might own multiple homes, and in a sense, as an officer, you'll do your role, but so much of it is down to the individual councillors on the planning committee. Do they prioritise this over something else? When they're approached by developers, do they raise it? Do they not? So I guess this goes beyond just this one issue, but I think the simple reality is, do you think that if we had councillors who were more diverse, particularly when it comes to age, this would be prioritised more by them?
Yeah, let's both say something.
When you asked the question earlier, I jotted down the stats about what you were describing, which are, so there was some research done by the Intergenerational Foundation, which is all about establishing better fairness between generations. And they established that the average age of the councillor in the UK is 60, which is, I think, exactly what you said. And that under 35s in local decision making are less than 5% of all, and that under 25s don't even touch aren't even registered. They don't hit they're not enough to be counted. And I think that exactly what you've just described is a huge issue, that if you have decision makers who are from a single demographic, or have something in common, which is that they are probably much more likely to be homeowners, much more likely to be car drivers, much, frankly, less long to live. And I don't mean that in any negative way. I just mean it's literally the truth that young people who have a vested interest in the longer term not being adequately represented does mean that you're going to have skewed decision making, and I think that's a hard one to solve. It's an observation that is the case, and if we're here sort of talking about how we change democratic processes, then I would say you need to get more young people, more diversity into decision making, because then it means that when proposals are put forward, they're going to be considered from a much greater perspective, an array of perspectives.
I'd just like to add to that that one of the real benefits of the youth engagement process that we've just been talking about with young people is not only the impact that they have on their environment and shaping it, but also their exposure to those conversations about the built environment and the importance of it, and their exposure to the professionals working in that arena. And so therefore, if you're wanting to build the future councillors of tomorrow, actually involving those young people in shaping their environment is a really great place to start. And there are also lots of emerging design review panels that are bringing in younger people that are appraising proposals, so they're involved in a discussion about other proposals elsewhere in their neighbourhood, elsewhere in their borough. So it's part of that sort of educational journey. It's not going to happen overnight, but that's a really good place to start.
So I think you're saying that doing something positive and engaging young people, obviously not necessarily just through planning committees, but it actually gives people a sense of control, a sense of involvement in the process. It is exciting. It gets people interested in the kind of careers that we need people to be in around construction and development, architecture, and so on. But it also helps to to cultivate more interest and more of a sense of participation, which maybe helps to solve some of the issues that you're talking about.
And a sense of agency.
Yeah.
I'm straying slightly outside the remit. We're focusing on new developments and planning policy. We're looking to the future, but the fact of the matter is most of our estates, etc., are already built. To what extent are the things that we're talking about now relevant for any councils or planners or anyone involved in urban regeneration schemes? Should they also be putting the focus on how is this going to work for children, young people?
So in terms of existing
Yes.
stock, absolutely. We're working on a number of projects, one down at Thamesmead where working with Peabody, in fact, we've kind of really rethought how external space works around existing housing, and it's had a huge impact. And not only has it improved the access to open space of the people living in those homes, and as we also know, there's a lot of discussion about retention of existing buildings for all the right reasons at the moment. So there's an opportunity when we're looking at building stock and what we can do with that in terms of retrofit to also start appraising the landscape and the play opportunities that sits around it. But the benefit of the work that we've been doing at Peabody is also that has fostered a sense of stewardship over that space that didn't exist before that. So the benefits are sort of manifold. It's not just in the sort of physical aspects of the built environment, but it's in terms of those conversations happening within a community and a housing the people owning that housing stock and placing value in that process. But also, for the future, that housing being managed better and the local community having a stewardship over it. So it's a real opportunity to do that better and to do it kind of with very focused engagement around some of these children and young people living in that housing.
Okay. Moving on to the national planning policy issues, and I'd just say on councillors, we did an inquiry into councillors and found out some of these concerning challenges a few years ago in the committee, and probably it's not surprising when you get councillors' allowance at the level they are, they're a little add-on for a pensioner. They actually don't replace loss of earnings for someone who is the working age. That's a real challenge, I think. Mohammed, on to national planning.
Thank you. I also used to be a member of planning committee, my local authority, and when we received new applications for new developments, first question coming to your mind, do you have parking? Hardly mention the needs of the children and young people. So I think they should be balanced. Of course, we need new homes. We need parking, but we also need to meet the needs of young people. If we want to live healthy and long life, we need air quality. We need area where we can play as a young people, and that's the way if you want to live healthy life and a long life. I think there should be a very clear national planning policy framework, purpose and guidance for local authorities, because a lot of councillors probably don't know what the policy is, if there is any. So what can national policy do to support better local planning for children, young people and the built environment? Sarah, you want to start first?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've touched on many of those points already. I think that the key thing is having, as you said, if you don't have a very strong mandate in the MPPF, it won't translate to local plans, or it won't translate to all local plans. So I think that's the absolute starting point. There has to be a greater emphasis on children in the MPPF, and it has to translate to local plans. And there I think you'll start to see policies coming through local plans. I think there's an opportunity in planning reform to really tackle that and to really take it and say we are developing new ways of developing our planning policy. We are developing new ways of talking to our communities about planning and trying to get people more engaged in a positive spin. I think there's an absolute win in saying that when we come to look at schemes, particularly large housing schemes, there has to be an absolute lens on how it's been designed to take account of young people and therefore the wider determinants of health and all the preventative approach things that we know are going to be making sure that, helping councils in the long run. This is about much more than just a planning policy. Yeah. It's about creating spaces that work in the future. So I think by having a very strong vision in the MPPF, following that through in local plans, and that the inspectorate are required to ask questions about that, and then you'll straight away see that planning policies are in place so that when developers come to planning pre-applications, for example, those discussions are framed in how have you approached this scheme in relation to how it works for young people and how it works in the long term.
What's the best way to better integrate young people and children in the built environment policy?
I mean, I think, as my colleagues have kind of touched on, it's a really fascinating place for children and young people to become part of. If you can capture and if you can hear what they want to say about their place, you get value added to anything that you're doing. So my proposition is that we have a requirement in the MPPF to do consultation with a certain amount of people, that's tested at inquiry, and that there is an emphasis on going into schools and to actively the local planning authorities actively seeking out young people to hear their views and to understand and test their planning policies with, and that when you get developers coming forward with large schemes, that there is also in the design access statement a requirement that says how have you engaged with young people in the area.
Anybody just want to come in? Jonny?
Well, I think beyond planning, I think if I was to sort of leave you with a thought, it's not just about planning. Planning is one tool, but so much of this conversation has been about planning, but it isn't the only tool. I think also there's an opportunity in public land and public grants. So we know that a lot of subsidy goes into the house building sector, and land is sold every day that's one way or another public land and ends up becoming private land. And I think that if we're trying to stimulate a sea change in the way that developers think about things, then it would be a great first step for government to look at the way that it sells public land and to place more requirement around this kind of agenda on those sorts of projects. Because the more that we see projects like Goldsmith Street, Marmalade Lane, some of the other projects that have been mentioned today coming forward, and we can see that there is actually a real demand for those kinds of places among members of the public, that parents of children will actually vote with their feet and buy a home or choose to live in a home because of the fact that it gives a really lovely, good urban environment that their children can thrive in, then actually it helps the sector as a whole, because it starts to build evidence that people will pay a premium or they will stay for longer in homes where children are prioritised. And that wouldn't be a surprise, because we all know that people would say that their children are their most important thing. It's just at the moment that doesn't always feed through to purchasing decisions. But I think that's not necessarily because people are selfish, as was mentioned earlier. It might be because there's not enough diversity in the housing offer for people to choose differently from what there is available to them. So my sort of suggestion, my plea would be to look at the tools that are available to see if we can stimulate housing that really does do what we're talking about and helps to provide evidence that it is actually more valuable and more beneficial and creates better social value outcomes for everyone.
Thank you. Jo, have you got any view?
I think I would echo the views of my colleagues, really, and just to say that the process to get there, Jonny's been talking about beyond planning and the other tools, but the process to get there, to incentivise everybody to prioritise young people and children's futures and the quality of their built environment is so important in how we design. And what I would say, I know there's been lots of discussion about an anxiety about adding extra policy and adding kind of more demands on a very long list, as we've all discussed. But actually, in lots of situations, if you are designing with children and young people in mind, those other things are quite easy to do. So you can create a really well organised and sustainable environment where you're achieving your biodiversity net gain because you're prioritising pedestrian routes and play space within the centre of a development, and it's not car dominated with lots of tarmac. So actually those things aren't in tension, but actually can work together. I think the big thing that needs to happen is a sort of readjustment of the sort of hierarchy of priorities, and children and young people should be top, because they're the future.
Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. I think on that note, probably that summarises quite a lot of what's been said to us about the way children probably aren't often considered at all, but ought to be considered first and foremost in many of these issues. So thank you all very much for coming and giving evidence to the committee today, and we'll be reflecting on that and coming up with a report having considered all the evidence in due course. Order. That brings us to the end of the public proceedings for today. Thank you very much.
The proceeding has ended.